Hello, my name is Thomas and I am a huge fan of this book, The Lord of the Rings. I'm very happy to have it in this special 50th anniversary edition because it's a big red book, which in the conceit of the story, right, so Tolkien doesn't write of himself as if he's a narrator, he writes of himself as if he's a translator of an ancient document, much like, say, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. I think it's a fantastic version of the book. I've got another version which is a 7-volume edition, and I really like that because it's got the 6 books that Tolkien envisaged in terms of the division of the story, and then the 7th, which is the appendices, and I really like that version. But maybe I should stop right here and talk about my love of J.R.R. Tolkien and his writing and all the things that have come from it. Like many, The Hobbit was read to me as a child and I absolutely loved it. It seemed a little uncanny, the things he was describing, the great Branduin River, the hills, especially as he described the Shire. It seemed uncannily familiar. At the time, I was living in Worcestershire, and in fact, Tolkien is thought to have largely based the Shire on West Worcestershire, where I was living. In fact, the Severn River, the Malvern Hills, all of these were familiar places to me, and it seems so vivid when he describes it. I had this book read to me, I then read it. I'd say it's partly how I learned to read. I moved fairly quickly onto The Lord of the Rings. I know I read it again and again. I couldn't honestly say when I truly began to understand it, but again, that first section rarely matched onto Worcestershire before it went beyond things that were familiar to me at the time. And of course, I went into the Silmarillion and all the various other things he wrote. It always seemed a bit unfair to me that Tolkien only wrote the one children's book, and that I had to kind of wait until I was an adult to fully appreciate everything else. But Tolkien is a great writer in the English language, and of course it's been adapted into other languages. So as a teenager I learned Turkish, and one of my treasured possessions is my Turkish translation of The Hobbit. I thought that's how I learned English, so maybe that's how I should learn Turkish. And what impressed me is how it translated the poems. Tolkien was a great poet, and that's not something you normally see in adaptations. I was impressed how the Turkish translator was able to translate the meaning of the poem as well as making it work in Turkish. Absolutely love that. As I say, it's something that's often dropped from adaptations, and there have been many. So for example, in the 70s you have the animated Lord of the Rings and so on, and that's viewed with some caution with fans. It was certainly an interesting artistic adventure. I think the BBC adaptation, penned by Brian Sibley, is one of the best adaptations of Tolkien's work. Of course, it had the time, it's 13 hours long, so it had the space to fully delve into the story, and it even adapted some of the songs, putting them to music magnificently. I really like that adaptation. It is of course audio only, it's not somebody reading a book, it is a full drama. I really like that, and of course Peter Jackson's epic movies. I saw them in the cinema, but the best version for me is his extended edition of The Lord of the Rings, partly because instead of having 3 very long films, you have 6 relatively normal length films, and certain things that may seem like kind of plot holes to the casual viewer are fully explained, and it paces a lot better. As I say, one thing I really like about Tolkien's work is the poetry. That comes from his love of Old English, in which some of the most important documents would be written in the form of poetry. Indeed, one of the oldest forms of English literature we have is the poem Beowulf, which I remember reading the translation by Seamus Healy. That really got me into that, and that was something that Tolkien, of course, studied. He was passionate about that, the heroic poetry of Britain before the Norman conquest in 1066. Again, that's an avenue that Tolkien led me down, because as a teenager, frustrated by the lack of Tolkien, this is not enough. I got into reading the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles and then poring over the Bard Tapestry. You could buy the book of it, and all the annotations, and more and more and more. But as I say, the poetry was really interesting because after the Norman conquest, poems can be, for example, more about romance, and you get the Arthurian legends being more about chivalry and so on. Of course, chivalry has a French language root, but Tolkien was all about the heroism, and that's something I thought worked really well. I've said it so many times, the poems are really, really good. I thought I'd go to one of my favourites. I wonder if it was one of Tolkien's favourites, because it actually comes up several times, each with slightly different variation. It's the road goes ever on and on. This is one of my favourite poems out of all the poems in Tolkien. The road goes ever on and on, down from the door where it began. Now far ahead the road has gone, and I must follow, if I can, pursuing it with eager feet until it joins some larger way, where many paths and errands meet, and whither then I cannot say. There's many different versions of this poem in the book. I really, really like it, and each time it changes, the change gives you a bit of an insight into the characters, Bilbo or Frodo, and where they are emotionally. There's many, many great poems. Like I said, they don't normally go into the different adaptations. So if you want to know why I really love Tolkien, all I can say is read the book, especially if it's a big red book like this. Supposedly, well, the whole story is based on a translation of the big red book.